This is a presentation over World War II and the Pacific Front. As you just read about, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor because they felt like the United States would try to interfere with their expansion onto different Pacific continents. Remember, Japan had become an imperial nation during imperialism and had decided to expand outwards. They felt like if they attacked the United States with a surprise attack, that the United States would not be able to respond to them expanding. Within 6 months, Japan had extended out to actually be larger than Hitler's Third Reich. They had conquered Hong Kong and French Indochina and Burma, Thailand, a lot of China, the Dutch East Indies. And in 1941, they decided to invade the Philippines. Keep in mind, there are American troops still stationed in the Philippines because of the fact that the Philippines was acting as a buffer nation. Remember back to the Philippine-American War, the reason why the United States conquered that was to make sure that Japan did not edge closer towards the United States. 80,000 American and Filipino troops battled the Japanese invasion, but they are overran. General Douglas MacArthur, who becomes the key player in the Pacific theater, was in control of the Allies on that island, and they are forced to retreat. This prompted the United States to gather up an air force to begin a counterattack on Japan. It leads to what's called Doolittles Raid. It's by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, and it's really the very start of the pushback against the Japanese. Up until this point, Japan had been conquering many different islands in the Pacific, and the Allies have mostly been losing. So they lost the Philippines, they lost a bunch of fairly minor islands. And in the spring of 1942, Doolittle begins raiding parties over Tokyo. Basically, he was mimicking what the Pearl Harbor attack was against the United States. During Pearl Harbor, the United States had been surprise attacked at their military base, and the idea was that they would kill them quickly and no one would ever know about it. Well, Doolittle and his men go and they start attacking Tokyo and other different cities. Problem is that Doolittle's raid is actually very unsuccessful because of wind and just kind of haphazard coordination. Doolittle and his men end up bombing mostly civilian targets and not really anything war-related. A lot of his men are also shot down. He had to retreat to China and the USSR directly after the attacks because they're chased by the Japanese, and only 3 of them end up surviving. 250,000 Chinese civilians are actually killed by Japanese troops searching for those Doolittle men. The movie Pearl Harbor actually talks about this a bit. Despite this, the overall idea of Doolittle's raid, interestingly enough, is that it raised U.S. morale and it damaged Japanese morale. The U.S. actually start pushing back against Japan because they feel like they are winning this battle, even though Doolittle's raid was ultimately unsuccessful. This leads into the Battle of Coral Sea. So prior to this, Australia and the United States were the 2 major allies on the Pacific Front. And the Battle of Coral Sea occurred when the Japanese started to expand towards Australia. Japan, just like they had invaded the Philippines, planned on invading Australia as well. And the Americans and Australians successfully hold off the Japanese. This battle was fought entirely using airplanes, pretty much just off the coast of Australia. And it was the first time that a Japanese invasion had been successfully stopped by the United States. This is going to lead to further victories by the United States, as it was kind of had a snowball effect. As soon as they won one battle, they could start winning more and more battles. This leads directly to the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway is probably the most important battle of the Pacific Front during World War II. Midway is northwest of Hawaii. It's roughly midway between Japan and the United States. The United States intercepts these Japanese plans that state that they're going to be refueling there. And when a boat refuels on the water, the fuel actually sinks out into the ocean. A admiral, his name was Chester Nimitz, he led these scout planes that found the ships and led this bombing fleet that ends up bombing that fuel that's on the ground and erupting all of the Japanese aircraft carriers into fire. Not only are those airplane carriers refueling, but also your airplanes are on those as well. So 250 planes are sunk. 4 aircraft carriers in total are sunk. This meant that Japan lost a considerable amount of Navy and their Air Force, and really, after this point, Japan does not have a real way to defend against American forces. The way that the Americans never had their code broken was by the Navajo code talkers. The Navajo Indians, or the Navajo language, had no alphabet or written symbols. The Navajo, being a Native American tribe, did not have the traditional way of writing that many Western nations did. and this was extremely successful during the war. Uh, they're often called the silent heroes. It's considered the most successful code in all of military history. Native Americans actually have a history through World War I and World War II of helping to code messages. It's actually quoted by Major Howard Connor, who fought at the Battle of Iwo Jima that we'll talk about in a second, that if it were not for the Navajos, the Marines would have never taken that island. The system was completely classified to the point that they didn't actually receive recognition until after the Korean War in 1969. During these different battles, the Japanese used a tactic called Kamikaze, which you've probably heard of before. This was a defense tactic, essentially, where Japanese bombers crashed their planes into Allied ships. They're suicide missions. The person would not eject before they hit the ship. The reason why this was a successful strategy was that just like how fuel worked to blow up ships in the Battle of Midway, the fuel from the airplane would catch fire to ships that it rammed into. This tactic is first used in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is an island off the southern coast of Japan. Another major battle in the war was the Battle of Iwo Jima. This occurred after the Allies had retaken the Philippines, which had happened shortly after the Battle of Midway, and it was an important island for the advancement towards Japan. Iwo Jima is an island, a fairly large island south of Japan, and this meant that Americans could load their bombers up there and then could reach Japan from that island. Japan, however, had really strong defenses, not by airplanes or by boats, but by troop numbers on the ground there, and many deaths were led to on both sides. A fun fact, if you will, of these battles is that Americans began collecting what were called a string of ears, which is literally what that sounds like. They would kill Japanese soldiers and collect their ears and put it on a string like a necklace, which kind of shows you some of the psychological effects these soldiers went through during the war. They would actually send those string of ears back to their wives back in the United States as like a gift present. So, your military wife would open up her Christmas Day present and it would be a string of ears of Japanese soldiers. Another major battle, the Battle of Okinawa, occurred directly after the Battle of Iwo Jima. It was even more fierce than that other battle. Again, you have kamikaze forces, and Allies lost thousands of lives, but the Japanese, again, lose a far greater amount. Winston Churchill has a pretty famous revelation where he talks about the fact that he was still worried about what was to come, and that deals with this, the Manhattan Project. It's probably the best kept secret, not only of World War II, it's really probably the best kept secret in the entire history of the United States, possibly even the world. And it was the development of the atomic bomb, and the research was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer. So a ton of people worked on this project. We're talking like 2,500 plus people worked on this project, but few people actually knew what it was for. It's estimated that only about 3 or 4 people actually knew what the entire project was. In fact, President Truman, who remember took office directly after FDR, he had died in office right around the time that the Nazis surrendered. Truman does not know about the atomic bomb. As Vice President of the United States, he didn't know about it until he was president. That's when he found out about the Manhattan Project. So it was extremely secretive. The atomic bomb, of course, is an extremely powerful nuclear weapon that we had been testing in the United States, but we weren't really sure how it would have an effect on human populations. And the United States had to make the decision whether or not they're going to drop this incredibly powerful bomb on both war but also civilian populations. And that's what you're going to be reading about in the readings that follow this presentation.